Hello everybody, my name is Brady. We're back with another React video, and today we're going to be checking out more Historia Civilis. We're going to be finishing up the Alexander the Great playlist, or at least I think we are. I'm a little bit confused here. I can't tell if he's not done with the series yet, because this is the last video in the playlist, and I believe it's the official playlist from his channel. It's 334 B.C.E, and I think that gives Alexander the Great maybe another decade? So I would assume that there's more videos that are going to be coming out in this series. It's just that this video is from like late 2019, and I don't know how often he updates stuff. So I guess I'm going to find out by the end of this if it feels conclusive. Who knows? Maybe he covers a lot of material here, but I'm glad to be doing this because it's been a while since I've touched on any of the Historia Civilis stuff. Assuming that this is the end, let me know which Historia Civilis stuff you want me to check out next in the comments. All right, so let's get this started.
It was May of the year 334 BCE, and Alexander the Great's invasion of the Persian Empire had just begun. For the moment, Alexander's stated goal was to pursue a policy of liberation for the Greek city-states living under Persian rule.
I gotcha. I'm an American, I speak that language. Liberation. I gotcha. We're speaking the same language here. I kind of find it fun that in two different series that I'm watching right now, we're dealing with the Persian Empire, but in very different eras. So I'm actually really excited about that. Because the Persian Empire, it has very different stages, but in many of which very powerful, very formidable, so I'm excited about this. I don't know if, I believe this would be considered, I don't know if it's their peak, but like sometime around this is like kind of their peak, right? Let me know if I'm right or wrong on that.
At least, that's what he was telling everybody, and at this point, there was no reason to doubt him. As the Macedonian expedition into Asia kicked off, it was already at risk of drowning under its own weight. Somehow, they managed to send 47,000 people across the Hellespont, but this meant that they only had enough money to feed and pay them for about a month. After that, the Macedonian state would become insolvent. Everything
is like me playing Civ.
Immediately winning some kind of major victory, using the spoils of that victory to finance the rest of the campaign. The whole endeavor was built on a financial house of cards. Alexander and the Macedonians began their campaign by marching on one of the larger regional cities. Capturing this city would solve their financial problem, at least in the short term. Alexander sent word that the Macedonians were here to liberate the city, only to receive word back that they were perfectly happy with Persian governance. This was not a great start to the campaign. They were being told that the whole justification for their invasion was incorrect, and that
you're going to be liberated whether you like it or not. That's always a fun little imperialist rationalization. It's a very modern rationalization, but it also shows how little things have really changed. While it is modern, it's not necessarily new. It's just a fashionable way of justifying things now, just as it was a fashionable way of justifying things throughout different points in history. As things change, the more they stay the same.
That the locals actually enjoyed the perks of living in the Persian Empire. Alexander didn't have the time or resources to invest in a proper siege, so he was forced to leave with his tail between his legs. One story claims that the locals bribed him to leave their city alone, but there's no way to verify this. With one setback under his belt, Alexander
that might keep them going a little longer. Who knows?
Along the way, small undefended villages surrendered to him, but this was purely symbolic. In order to really shake things up, the Macedonians would need to capture a major city, or win a decisive victory against the Persians. By the way, where were they? While this was going on, a council of Persian governors were deciding how they should respond to the Macedonian invasion. One of the people invited to this meeting was a man named Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek national working
I've heard that name, I think.
who was in charge of a division of Greek mercenaries. Memnon was familiar with Macedon, and
could be mistaken.
importantly, he was familiar with the Macedonian economy. He knew that this tiny country must be bleeding itself dry in order to field an army of this size. With this in mind, Memnon advocated a scorched earth policy. Burn the crops, evacuate the towns, and pull back. Use the Persian fleet to cut the Macedonians off from the Greek mainland.
We're getting a lot of themes from video to video that covering completely different times, but we're covering a lot of similar themes. And I think that's cool because we get to see how policies like scorched earth have worked out in very different scenarios. Alexander the Great is known for winning. I honestly don't know the minutia of things, but we're going to be getting around to that sort of stuff. But honestly, I get these vibes that domestically he seemed to be a little bit short-sighted.
By the end of the year, he argued, the Macedonians would be suing for peace without the need for any bloodshed. The Persian governors looked at Memnon like he'd lost his damn mind. This Greek was advising them not to attack the invading Greek army. The governors rejected his advice. Instead, they decided to combine their forces and attack the Macedonians directly. By the way, history tells us that...
And in hindsight, hindsight's 2020, so I can't necessarily blame these guys for being skeptical here and questioning this guy's motives. Like, who knows what his motives are, but like, we get that Alexander's empire was, in a sense, a little bit fragile. It was expansive, and it's going to be really impressive or whatever, but we know what happens afterwards, and it kind of just falls apart. So there are some cracks in the armor here. So this guy was probably in the right.
That Memnon was nothing but loyal. A retreat would have been politically hard to justify, but his analysis was correct. A scorched earth policy would have confounded the Macedonian plans. Instead, the Persians were doing exactly what Alexander wanted them to do.
Take him head on.
Too long, Alexander started to hear...
Just give him a reason.
There was a Persian army waiting for him near the Granicus River, only a day's march away. He immediately set out to meet them and arrived sometime in the mid-afternoon. The Persians had sensibly taken a defensive position on the other side of the river. The river was crossable on foot, but the banks were unusually muddy and steep. Climbing the banks of the river in the middle of a battle would totally mess up the Macedonian phalanxes and would grind any potential cavalry charge to a halt. Estimates for the sizes of
those are like some of their best things.
Wildly in all directions, but the historical consensus is that the Macedonians had between 35 and 50,000 men, and that the Persians had between 35 and 40,000, giving the Macedonians a slight numerical advantage. My own personal theory is that the real Macedonian number was around 47,000, and that the discrepancy comes from some of the ancient sources forgetting to count the 10,000 Macedonians that were already in Asia, waiting for Alexander to arrive. Plus, we have reliable numbers from later battles, so you either have to argue that the Macedonian army magically grew over time, or that the army started out at the larger end of the spectrum. Anyways, reasonable people disagree, but in my opinion, the Macedonians had 47,000 men, and the Persians had between 35 and 40,000. Memnon of Rhodes was present with him.
So, by all means, it feels like Alexander should be able to win here, but there's also, I guess if they were going with that other guy's idea of kind of just starving them out, even if they decided not to go with the same way that he planned it, like not doing the scorched earth, not doing the retreating thing, Even if they didn't do that, they could take into account the fact that they have been presented with the Macedonian weakness and probably play off that, be less aggressive, and perhaps just wait them out until they just run out of resources and everything ends up falling apart for them. They can still technically do that, and not being too aggressive might favor them in this situation. Just kind of try to drag things out as much as they can.
His 5,000 or 6,000 elite Greek mercenaries. But even with his help, the Persians knew that they were outclassed in the infantry department. However, they also had with them between 10 and 20,000 of some of the best heavy cavalry in the world, which was double or triple the number that Macedon had. The Persians placed their cavalry at the front of their line, ready to charge as soon as the Macedonians reached the bank of the river. They would hold their light infantry and Greek mercenaries in reserve. It was not entirely clear how the Macedonians should proceed. It was late in the day, and the Granicus River stood between them and the enemy. What should they do? Alexander's second-in-command, Parmenion, advised him to encamp for the night and wait. He argued that since the Macedonians had superior numbers, the Persians might want to pull back and wait for reinforcements. If so, the Macedonians should just let them. In Parmenion's opinion, attacking across the river was an unnecessary risk. Alexander responded, saying something like, "It would be a disgrace if, after crossing the Hellespont, this tiny river stood in our way for even a moment." He also went on about the courage and valor of the Macedonian people, blah blah blah, a bunch of nonsense.
I mean, to a degree, like, I kind of get where he's coming from. Like, if I were in charge, we wouldn't have gotten this far. By virtue of the circumstances, the Macedonians have to be the aggressors here. If they don't gain ground, if they don't gain victories, then the Persians essentially win by default. So I understand why Alexander wants to be aggressive. Also, with the way that he has governed, he's going to need to start picking up some resources at some point. So, like, I think to a degree he's in the right. I think there's something fundamental in the nature of his imperialism that may be a little bit misguided, despite how this is going to end. But if you are going down this route, honestly, he sounds, while a little bit too excited, I guess it's sound logic for the circumstances that you've already found yourself in.
For the record, historians seriously disagree over whether or not this conversation actually took place. It pops up in one of our less reliable ancient sources, and it kicks off a pattern that repeats itself over and over again, where Alexander is faced with a problem, Parmenion suggests a rational solution, and Alexander does the exact opposite. Many have argued, and it's a legitimate argument, that we're not really supposed to take these conversations at face value, but instead see them more as a literary device created by the author to highlight Alexander's unique style of leadership. So,
you know, that seems like a common factor in a lot of Greek history, which a lot of it has some mixtures of mythology. You know, a lot of places have a mixture of history and mythology. I mean, I'm from the United States. We have a ton of mythology in our history, but there is something very unique in the Greek presentation of its mythology that kind of mixes its way into the history, and I think it's absolutely fascinating. I'm not smart enough or well-versed in Greek history enough to analyze these things and differentiate the real from the fake a lot of the time, but it's really cool to hear smarter people than me talk about.
If we're not sure that this conversation happened, why did I include it here? Well, if Parmenion wasn't giving this kind of advice, he definitely should have been. Attacking across a river after a long day's march is a very bad idea. Parmenion knew this, but his advice went unheeded. Alexander ordered an immediate attack across the river.
Like, I think I sympathize with Alexander if you give him the already reckless nature of the campaign. I guess the already underlying recklessness makes me kind of lean in the direction of that, because if you're gonna do it, just do it. Like, if you go out there and then just sit on your hands for a little bit, then the campaign it might just eat itself. I don't know. They are kind of on a bit of a timer. While I'm inclined to agree with the guy on top here, I also understand the urgency of Alexander, assuming this is a real conversation. Yeah.
River. The Macedonians deployed for battle, with their heavy infantry in the center and their companion cavalry on the wings. The king would take command of the right flank, and Parmenion would take command of the left. The Persians could see Alexander with his distinctive armor and his bodyguards, and repositioned some of their own cavalry in response.
Ooh.
Alexander initiated the battle by ordering his center to advance, sending his heavy infantry and some cavalry into the river. The Persians hit the Macedonians with every arrow at their disposal as they slowly made their way across the river.
I think they should be scared of those guys on the right, though.
Macedonian right, Alexander charged with his companion
or the left.
Cavalry. Parmenion on the
They're
left
right.
did the same. But unlike Parmenion, Alexander and his cavalry didn't go straight across the river. Instead, they crossed at a sharp angle, ignoring the enemy opposite them and heading straight for the Persian center. When they got
Seems kind of crazy.
to the bank of the river, they charged. Suddenly, the Macedonian companion cavalry, led by the king himself, were in the midst of the Persian lines, fighting in all directions at once. There was a violent, chaotic struggle. One source describes the cavalry being crammed so tightly together that they were fighting more like infantry, standing still and hacking away with their swords and spears in order.
Oh God, look at that rectangle. What's he doing to that rectangle? Just describing the very specifically violent visuals and just seeing rectangles. Honestly, there's something really hilarious about that. I'm just thinking of like really, really violent rectangles. That's all I can really picture in my head. Just bumping into each other like some sort of red rectangular substance coming out, but like, I don't know, the visual is kind of funny in my head.
To make incremental gains. Alexander was right there in the middle of this. His ancient Trojan shield,
what a crazy boy,
several direct hits, and his distinctive armor attracted a lot of Persian attention. At some point, Alexander's spear snapped,
he just
and
had to be a show-off.
One from his bodyguard. It was intense. It wasn't long before a second wave of Persian cavalry arrived to reinforce the center. Alexander rallied the companions and charged for a second time. Mid-charge, somebody threw a javelin right at the king, but Alexander managed to catch it with his Trojan shield. He yanked the javelin free and then charged straight at the person who threw it, one of the enemy cavalry commanders. Alexander and the Persian cavalry commander met.
Oh, this is a different visual.
Alexander's spear took the Persian in the chest, puncturing his armor and wounding the rider. The impact snapped the tip off of Alexander's spear, rendering the weapon useless.
Oh no.
Although he was wounded, the cavalry commander stayed on his horse. Sword in hand, he prepared to strike Alexander down, who was basically just sitting there holding a big stick. As a last resort,
he's got a shield or a banana, I'm not sure.
With his broken spear. Macedonians were deadly accurate with these weapons, and it paid off here, because the splintered end of the spear hit the Persian rider right in the face, knocking him off his horse. Alexander's victory was short-lived, because while he was doing this, another Persian came up behind him, lodging his sword into the back of the king's head, cutting clean through his helmet and into his scalp. Dazed, Alexander was somehow able to draw his own sword and kill his attacker.
So a thing about Alexander, and I like to be upfront with what I do and don't know. I know there's the different conversations about his death, and I've spoken to people who are big into this stuff, and I don't know what the popular consensus is on his death. I know there's the story of him potentially being poisoned. I also heard a different version of the story that he basically succumbed to injuries. Like, a lot of injuries kind of piling up, because unlike modern leaders, he's out there in the field taking a significant amount of damage, and I heard that it's possible that it was just his wounds just piled up and his body just gave up. But I don't know which one historians tend to lean towards these days. These are just stories that I've heard from, like, history buffs.
While his back was turned, a third Persian rider charged, sword in the air, ready to kill the king. At the last moment, one of Alexander's personal bodyguards named Cletus the Black, which is just the best name ever, cut the guy's arm off.
It's a pretty sick name.
Life. Alexander's personal bodyguards rallied to his side and fought some kind of defensive action around the king. Our sources don't explicitly say why this happened, but some people believe that it's because Alexander fell unconscious. This makes the most sense to me, but I want to make it clear that none of our ancient sources actually say this. While
if he got, like, stabbed in the head,
unconscious on the ground,
or slashed in the head,
Macedonian heavy infantry were still trickling across the river.
Maybe.
Just take a moment to appreciate how much of a disaster this was. Their king was wounded, perhaps unconscious, perhaps even dying, they didn't know, and the majority of the Macedonian army had yet to join the battle. Parmenion was right. Alexander's charge across the river had indeed been reckless, and one could argue, downright stupid.
The formation, like, initially I was thinking, okay, you got something, but then when he cut across the middle there, that didn't seem like it could go well in any capacity. He seems like if you are gonna do this, that didn't feel like the smartest way of going about it. And I'm no military strategist, but the second he started going that way, I'm like, okay, dude, I don't think I can defend your decision anymore. At first, I was thinking, okay, I understand your urgency. I feel for you in a sense. I understand what you're trying to accomplish, and while I disagree, I get you're gonna have to be assertive and do something. And it can't always wait. But the second he started cutting across there, ignoring the people that were set across from him, I lost all sense of what he was actually aiming to do.
You will about Alexander's recklessness. The companion cavalry did create enough space for the Macedonian infantry to get themselves across the river. Once they were back in formation, they slowly began to push the Persian cavalry back. Now that the infantry was in the fight, the companion cavalry got a few minutes to recover. In no time at all, Alexander was back up on his horse again. The Persian center was beginning to cave, which meant that it was time to commit their reserves.
Get that guy some ibuprofen.
The Greek mercenaries were well disciplined and held their own, but the Persian light infantry were inexperienced and ill-equipped. The Macedonian phalanxes continued to gain ground. At this key moment, Parmenion, who had been conservatively fighting on the left this entire time, led an incredibly well-timed cavalry.
I knew this guy was going to be a big deal here.
This sent most of the Persians into a full rout. The elite Greek mercenaries, however, would not budge.
Oof.
The exhausted Macedonian phalanxes ground to a halt. Alexander, still addled from taking a sword to the head, attempted to rally the army by leading a third and final cavalry charge against the Greek mercenaries.
You've done enough.
During this charge, Alexander's horse was killed, and the king was thrown to the ground for a second time. Hopefully, at this point, somebody told him to take a knee and cool it with the near-death experiences.
Like I said, I don't know what is the more popular belief from historians as to why he died, but the more I hear this episode specifically, the more I think, you know, this level of recklessness, living life like this for a while, I mean, I could imagine somebody succumbing to their injuries here. Like, the fact is, I don't know how much further a normal person could go from where he is right now. He's already had a near-death experience, and he's quite persistent, though. You can't take away his bravery.
The final bit of fighting was tough, but the outcome was inevitable. The Greek mercenaries couldn't take on the entire Macedonian army. They eventually surrendered. Let's talk about losses. All of the 5,000 or 6,000 Greek mercenaries were killed or captured. But because of this, the Macedonians never had a chance to pursue the fleeing Persians, which made their losses remarkably small. Only around 2,500 Persian cavalry were killed. We don't know how many Persian light infantry were lost, but probably not that many, since they were held back for most of the battle.
The scale of these battles is still pretty large. Like it's the way it's animated makes it look a little bit smaller than it actually is, so it's good that he gives us the actual numbers to give us some perspective here, because when you break it down into rectangles, I might not appreciate it as it was, as big as it was.
The Persian defeat was decisive, and yet over 3/4 of their army escaped. They got lucky. The Macedonian losses were even smaller than that. According to our sources, it's possible that as few as 150 Macedonians were killed. That number sounds way too low, and it probably is. Again, our sources suck, but bear in mind that 10 times that number would have been wounded as well.
I'm just saying, like, I know the idea was bad in the grand scheme of things, but the numbers don't lie. Unless they lie, unless the numbers are wrong, and numbers can be wrong. But from the looks of this, like, okay, 1,500 are wounded. That's still pretty significant. That's you've made a point. You've demonstrated your power in some capacity here. There's something there. Yeah. Alexander was like completely reckless, and there were some stupid things there, but he does seem to understand the strength of his own army.
Whatever the real number is, it's remarkable that so few Macedonians were lost. It's even more remarkable considering how the king's recklessness almost got him killed.
Bird's playing with his toy, sorry. You're gonna have to deal with it.
But he still had massive financial problems.
Because we have like 1 minute
left. He had repealed taxation back home, and the entire apparatus of state was basically running off of the spoils of conquest. He looted the enemy camp and sent whatever treasure he could find back home, but frankly, there wasn't much there. In desperation, he enslaved the captured Greek mercenaries and sent them back to Macedon to work in the mines. Enslaving his fellow Greeks was not good PR, considering that the whole justification for this war was the liberation of the Greek people.
Liberation. We've talked about this. Don't worry. We're on the same page. I understand where you're going with. Oh, jeez, this is awful. The enslavement of fellow Greeks. That is. It's interesting seeing how different cultures approach slavery, and it's good to know that this is at least frowned upon. There are certain rules, formal or informal, in different eras of slavery, of like who it's okay to enslave and who it's not okay to enslave. I'm just glad that they draw the line somewhere.
Anyways, the spoils from the Battle of the Granicus did buy Alexander.
I guess they're not really drawing the line.
He could use that time
like a dotted line, if
to
anything.
capture a major city. His financial problems would go away. This was achievable, since the Western Persian Empire now stood largely undefended. However, success brought with it new problems. What had begun as a minor border issue had become an existential threat to the Persian Empire. Darius III of Persia, King of Kings, finally took notice and ordered an army assembled so that he could meet this threat personally.
Bow down to the king. All right, so it's not done yet. Okay, so I've checked out the Alexander the Great playlist. I believe that's all of them in it, so I guess he just hasn't finished the Alexander the Great stuff. So I guess I can afford to take a diversion, check out some of his other stuff, and I guess wait for the next Alexander the Great thing to come out, because I believe he has 10, maybe 11 years It's off the top of my head, but something like that. If you care, you can Google it. Alexander the Great's death date. But yeah, he's got some time left, and he's already like getting wrecked. I mean, he's doing a great job in a sense, but like he took a beating in this one. So I'm excited to see whenever he gets around to it, if he does, if he chooses to continue this series. I have my eye on just the rest of the Greek playlist. I believe there's one or two left. I think there's like the government or something like that, Constitution or something of Athens, and then there's one of Sparta. I believe both of those are in the playlist. There's plenty of stuff on Rome and Julius Caesar and stuff. A lot of you have suggested the Julius Caesar stuff. I'm going to see if he has any like one-offs that might be fun. Just like random things that don't really fit into like a broader narrative, just one-off videos. We'll see what I find. So thank you guys for watching. If there's anything else you want me to check out from Mr. Civilis, let me know in the comment section below. I think that's about it. Do we have anything else? You could always donate to the charity we're doing for the Native American Heritage Association. It's below pretty much all of my videos. It should be, at least. If all is going well, you can become a channel member. And that's about it. All right. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you tomorrow with another video. All right. Bye.